Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about secondary characters. We've done a number of videos on developing characters in the past, and while a lot of it can apply to both your protagonists or your secondary characters, today we're going to focus specifically on some tips and tricks that you can use to develop the secondary characters of your story, so the characters other than the main characters. These are the supporting cast, the background characters who are not the narrator of the story, and in some cases may play a bit more of a background role, but are still present and an important part of creating a rich and well-developed story. Even with a really well-developed protagonist, if your supporting cast isn't well-developed and doesn't feel convincing, it won't feel like a rich and well-developed world, especially for those secondary characters who play an instrumental part in the conflict and are an important part of how the story unfolds. Tip number 1 is to use showing. This is the old show don't tell. It comes up time and time again, but it's a really important aspect of developing your supporting cast. Develop your side characters and their traits along with their relationship to the main character through active scene rather than just explaining. So for example, instead of saying Mary was my best friend and had a great sense of humor, but her life was a total mess, and every time I saw her, she told me about her latest disaster. Ideally, you would show an interaction between the main character and Mary, where Mary is being funny and showing off her sense of humor. We can sense the familiarity and know that these two characters are very close. Probably best friends, and Mary can be talking about the latest chaotic development of her life. Exposition can still be useful to quickly develop aspects of side characters and establish relationships to the main character, but if you rely too much on telling without any showing, the side characters won't feel very convincing. What we're told about a character needs to also be supported by what we're shown. And although telling can be useful for conveying information, it doesn't usually give a rich depiction of a character on the page that makes them feel alive. Tip number 2, favor narrative instead of dialogue for exposition. In the cases where you do need to share a bit of exposition about your side characters, try to include this in the narrative instead of in dialogue. A lot of writers try to avoid exposition by including the exposition in dialogue, but this is actually a lot more awkward than just including that information in the narrative. Of course, it might make sense for a secondary character to tell the main character something about themselves if it's something the main character doesn't know, but it rarely makes sense for characters to rehash information they both already know about each other. So when you're trying to establish background details about a character or their relationship, and you want to do that through exposition, just include that exposition in the narrative. Tip number 3, give them goals outside of the story. Secondary characters are just as real and complex as the protagonist. The story just isn't focusing on them. But just because the narrative isn't focusing on their journey and their internal world doesn't mean they don't have their own journey and internal world. Even if they're not the focus of the story, the reader should get the sense that this character is just as complex off the page as the protagonist is on the page. One important aspect of this, or a good way to establish that they have their own life, is to give them goals outside of the story or beyond the main character. So the reader believes that they have their own life goals and interest, even when they're not actively present in the protagonist's life and being shown on the page. Characters who only exist to serve a role in the protagonist's story, but we don't get a sense that they exist beyond that, will just feel like plot devices rather than well-rounded characters. The next tip is to use them to develop and contrast with your protagonist. A relationship between two characters can serve the purpose of developing both characters as individuals. And in the case of side characters, you might want to ask how they can develop and contrast your protagonist. How can the relationship or interactions that they have with your protagonist further develop the protagonist in a way that's important to the story? How can we learn something about both of these characters through their interactions and through their relationship? You might want to try and identify a contrast. Maybe these characters are foils to each other. Maybe when faced with the same problem, they react in very different ways. Maybe the side character kind of fleshes out another side of a theme that is being explored in the main character's storyline. Exploring contrast between protagonist and side characters can be a really valuable way to use their interactions on the page to develop the overall themes and qualities of your protagonist. And along with that, develop compelling dynamics. The thing with secondary characters is that we typically only see them when they're present in the protagonist's life, right? So because of that, you want to make all the dynamics that your protagonist has with the side characters around them really compelling. If they have a boring relationship or boring dynamic, the side characters will seem boring because we're only understanding them and seeing them on the page through these interactions. And this leads to the next point, which is to create conflict. One of the most important or impactful ways to make a dynamic more interesting is to create conflict in the relationship. Perhaps they have opposing goals or some kind of long-standing unresolved tension. If there's any way that you can add more conflict or tension into the relationship, it will add a lot of layers of interest to this relationship and to this character. Try to think about the things that they aren't telling each other, the things that they're hiding from each other, the points where they disagree, the things that they don't quite understand about each other. Two characters who always get along and just always perfectly understand each other might be great friends in real life, but don't always make the most compelling relationship on the page. The next tip is to be specific and distinct. You have less access to subtlety with side characters and potentially no access to their internal thoughts. So try giving your side characters more distinct traits that can set them apart immediately so they don't just blend into the crowd, especially if you have a lot of side characters. Now, of course, you don't want your side characters to feel like caricatures where they only have one thing about them or one over-the-top personality trait. But when developing side characters, you may have to rely a little more on overt qualities rather than a lot of nuances. Of course, you can still explore these characters in a nuanced way, but try quickly establishing something distinct about them, whether that's their job, a specific interest, a specific habit that they have, or just a couple specific personality traits that really set them apart so the reader has an immediate and clear impression of them. One great way to do this is to just put some time into writing an interesting physical description of the character. Personally, I think that the physical description is a really great way to establish a side character quickly. If none of your side characters are physically described, if you're introducing a lot of side characters, it can be easy to start mixing them up because the reader has no mental image of them. So putting just a couple sentences into a clear but interesting physical description of a side character, going into detail about what they wear and what their body language is like and any interesting features that they have, can create a really distinct, clear picture of them in the reader's mind. And finally, create side characters with purpose. If you can't answer the question, why is this character here, they may not be necessary. The more side characters are in your book, the less time there is to dedicate to each one, and the harder it is to develop your entire cast in a convincing way. Adding extraneous characters that aren't pulling their weight and aren't earning their place in the story hurts the story overall, and also hurts the development of the other characters. It can cause confusion, and you're just adding characters that don't serve a purpose. If you have multiple characters that could potentially be condensed into one, or extraneous characters that don't need to be there, you may want to consider cutting them or saving them for another story. And when you're adding new characters to a project, be intentional and ask yourself what purpose this character is serving in the story and if they really need to be there. You don't want to end up with an overcrowded cast where there isn't time to adequately develop all the characters in a rich and compelling way. It's better to have a smaller cast where every single character really earns their place and you have time to develop all of them. So those are some tips for creating interesting and well-developed side characters. I'll leave some links to other videos we've done on characterization because a lot of those tips will also apply. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We post new writing, editing, or publishing tips every Friday. Until next time, bye!